Okay, so I'm live. Hopefully you can hear me okay. If you can't hear me okay, I'm going to have to do this as well because you don't want to see V in the background doing her work. So I will sit at an angle, inconvenience myself, and hurt my neck. I've got cookies as well.
Yeah, we got you cookies.
I got them on the way back from work. Okay. So, what we're going to be taking a look at today, guys, and I know some of you might well be Christians who are here, but something that, I know I'm no longer in that tribal group, right? I'm quite firmly opposed to apologists and the sort, unfortunately. But often what goes on is they'll kind of say, well, you atheists, you just don't like philosophy because you're idiots, and you don't read books, and if you read all the books, if you knew everything, we've got Descartes, we've got Leibniz, Plato, all these people, and so I thought maybe what we could do, as I know I've got quite a few atheists who watch my channel, is talk about some philosophy, specifically going through some of the primary source stuff as well, and then some secondary source stuff on top of that. And I don't want to make this like this should be like inquiry for inquiry's sake, and this should be like if you're interested in it, if it's something that you want to know about it, then it's for you. This is just going to like be going through a bit of Descartes. What we're going to take a look at is first Descartes' kind of contribution to epistemology and the quest for knowledge, and then we're going to take another quick look at Descartes and his kind of idea of the self, and maybe we'll get into some kind of soul stuff. Scott Duke, I 100% agree for myself, not with it, not that you are, but that applies to me. And yeah, welcome everyone who's joined. I see we've got Millen, some guy. Millen, you get, is it 500 Nathan Nichols for being here first, Scott Duke, Nathaniel Robinson, KCA Randy, V is obviously here in Seoul as well. Spartan Theology, hello, if I didn't mention you. Interesting decorating style. It's kind of, I mean, I was against it, but V really likes the look, so it's got to stay. So yeah, what we're going to look at, and I hadn't really thought this through 100%. Let's go. Actually, I'll use my copy of it. I need like a second camera where I could like show you books and things that I was looking at. But basically, the meditations of Descartes, we're gonna use that, and then some of this pile of books down here as well is what we're going to use. Very professionally done, as you can see. So various people speculate on why Descartes wrote the Meditations, and maybe most of you actually saw my interview with Lauren Slater. I hope I got her surname right. Maybe not. She's doing her PhD on Descartes anyway. And we talked a little bit about his history, potential motivations. Maybe he was trying to, think about culture at the time, very heavily dominated by that kind of medieval Catholicism, intellectually, scholastics, people following in the footsteps of Aristotle. And Descartes kind of undermines this, but he, like some people like Noam Chomsky, however seriously you take him, will speculate that the reason Descartes' writing is, just to get the Jesuits to take his philosophy seriously. Other people speculate that what Descartes wants philosophically is like a certain foundation to build his worldview up from. I'm not going to really comment either way because, to be honest, I've not read enough to know. But we're just going to go through this together and see what's coming out. So we're going to be looking really, the first meditation is quite short, and then we'll look at some commentaries around that, and then we'll come on to a little bit of the second meditation as we talk about self, what that might be, which is a question that Big Des is trying to ask. Hey, Nathan. Oh, hey, and hey, Camille as well in the chat. And I almost forgot your name for a second then. I was like freaking out. Bear in mind, I've not really eaten since coming back from work, apart from that half biscuit. Hey, gorgeous. Hey, Nate. Right. So we're going to, first I'll just read a little bit from the first meditation, and then we can go from there. It's some years now since I realized how many false opinions I had accepted as true from childhood onwards, and that whatever I had since built on such shaky foundations could only be highly doubtful. Hence I saw that at some stage in my life, the whole structure would have to be utterly demolished, and that I should have to begin again from the bottom up if I wished to construct something lasting and unshakable in the sciences. But this seemed to be a massive task, and so I postponed it until I had reached the age when one is as fit as one will ever be to master the various disciplines. Hence I have delayed so long that now I should be at fault if I used up in deliberating the time that is left for acting. The moment has come, and so today I have discharged my mind from all its cares, and have carved out a space of untroubled leisure. I have withdrawn into seclusion, and shall at last be able to devote myself seriously and without encumbrance to the task of destroying all my former opinions. Okay, I'm not sure why V is encouraging some kind of mutiny of harassment in the chat, but don't do what V says. It's a bad idea. What you could, yeah, I'm not going to say that. Okay. To this end, however, it will not be necessary to prove them all false, a thing I should perhaps never be able to achieve. But since reason already persuades me that I should no less scrupulously withhold my assent from what is not fully certain and indubitable than from what is blatantly false, then in order to reject them all, it will be sufficient to find some reason for doubting each one. Nor shall I therefore have to go through them each individually, which would be an endless task. But since once the foundations are undermined, the building will collapse of its own accord. I shall straightway attack the very principles that form the basis of all my former beliefs. So basically what Descartes is saying here is when he's like reflecting upon his thoughts and beliefs about the world, that there's certain propositions, right, that we might think are true. However, where those propositions are part of certain classes. Now, so if Descartes was to like go through every single proposition, then that would be far too much of a task. You know, like I don't know, billions and billions of beliefs we probably have about the world. I don't know how you could really quantify that. And if you were to go through each one of them and think about them and discard them, that'd almost take forever. So Descartes basically saying that if a proposition is in a class of propositions that can be doubted, then he's going to just throw away the whole class. Certainly, up to now, whatever I have accepted as fully true, I have learned either from or by the means of the senses. But I have discovered that they sometimes deceive us, and prudence dictates that we should never fully trust those who have deceived us even once. So with this senses here, he's saying that, we're sometimes this is quite like an ancient argument. If you remember in my interview with Professor Henrik Lagerlund on the history of skepticism, when he was talking about the Pyreneans, and they'd have like these arguments, for example, about like the modes of sensory experience. So if if one hand is cold and then both hands grab like a hot object, then they both sense it as different. And so like this is reason to question whether how we know our senses are veridical, right? So Descartes saying here, he's got reason to doubt the senses, and so he's going to throw away that whole class of propositions in the bin. But perhaps although they sometimes deceive us about things that are little, or rather a long way away, there are plenty of other things of which there is clearly no doubt, although it was from the senses that we learned them. For instance, that I am now here, sitting by the fire, wrapped in a warm winter gown, handling this paper. So he's saying even when we doubt the senses, there's a bunch of propositions that are left over. Indeed, that these hands themselves and this whole body are mine. What reason could there be for doubting this? Unless perhaps I were to compare myself to one of those madmen whose little brains have been so befuddled by a pestilential, that's a word I don't know, vapor, arising from the black bile, that they swear blind that they are kings, though they are beggars, or that they are clad in purple when they are naked, or that their head is made of clay, or that their whole body is a jug or made entirely of glass. I'd like to know what drug he's referring to here exactly, because on erowid.org I've never heard anything exactly like that. I'm going to have a little bit of biscuit. It wasn't pestilence V, you see. That was why I didn't know the word. It's pestilential. I've never... So there we go. But they are lunatics, and I should seem no less of a madman myself if I should follow their examples in any way. This is all very... So he's talking about, like arguments from hallucination here. And he's not going to... Basically, he discredits arguments from hallucination because he doesn't want to be like a madman who takes drugs or something. I don't know what he's really getting at there. This is all very well, to be sure, but I am not a human being, and therefore But am I not? He is a human being. But am I not a human being, and therefore in the habit of sleeping at night, when in my dreams I have all the same experiences as these madmen do when they are awake, or sometimes even stranger ones? How often my sleep at night has convinced me of all these familiar things, that I was here, wrapped in my gown, sitting by the fire, when in fact I was lying naked, under the bedclothes. All the same, I am now perceiving this paper with eyes that are certainly awake. The head I am nodding is not drowsy. I stretch out my hand and feel it knowingly and deliberately. A sleeper would not have these experiences so distinctly. But have I then forgotten those other occasions on which I have been deceived by similar thoughts in my dreams? When I think this over more carefully, I see so clearly that waking can never be distinguished from sleep by any conclusive indications that I am stupefied. And this very stupor comes close to persuading me that I am asleep after all. Now, I don't know how true that is of my dreams. I can barely I mean, I can't even remember the last time I had a dream, but to me it seems when I reflect on what dreams are like, maybe it's different when I'm in them, I have no idea, but it seems that they have quite a different quality to them to my everyday experience. I don't know tell me what you guys think about that, or if you're actually in the know about modern psychologists research on that type of stuff. But of course, Richard Feynman says all that isn't real science. So, okay, maybe it's different for different people about that dreaming point. But I mean, definitely it is different. But maybe there's such I don't know, such qualitative differences between dreams that you can hardly even compare the argument between people or something. Let us then suppose that we are dreaming, and that these particular things, that we have our eyes open, are moving our head, stretching out our hands, are not true, and that perhaps we do not even have hands or the rest of a body like what we see. It must nonetheless be admitted that the things we see in sleep are, so to speak, painted images, which could not be formed except on the basis of a resemblance with real things, and that for this reason these general things at least, such as eyes, head, hands, and the rest of the body, are not imaginary things, but real and existing. For the fact is that when painters desire to represent sirens and little satyrs with utterly unfamiliar shapes, they cannot devise altogether new natures for them, but simply combine parts from different animals. Or if perhaps they do think up something so new that nothing at all like it has ever been seen, which is thus altogether fictitious and false, it is certain that at least the colours which they combine to form images must be real. By the same token, even though these general things, eyes, head, hands, and so forth, might be imaginary, it must necessarily be admitted that at least some other, still more simple and universal realities must exist, from which, as the painter's image is produced from real colours, all these images of things, they be true or false, that occur in our thoughts are produced. In this category, it seems we should include bodily nature in general and its extension. So just to clarify what's going on here, so we've had that first wave of doubt of the senses. We've had what's classically known as the second wave of doubt, that you might be in a dream or something, and that gets rid of a bunch of other categories of propositions that we might have. And now this third wave of doubt, and I'm doing it the German way because otherwise the Nazis will realize that I'm a spy, like in Inglourious Bastards, the film. So now this So now, yeah, he's saying, well, there's still stuff left over, even if we're in a dream. So, for example, there must be some resemblance to some reality that things are tethered. Or, for example, he's about to say geometric kind of space, quantity, stuff like that. That's in the kind of imagery of dreams must be real in a sense, and he's not got reason to doubt those yet. So, in this category, it seems we should include bodily nature in general and its extension, likewise the shape of extended things and their quantity, magnitude, and number, likewise the place in which they exist, the time during which they exist, and such like. From all this, perhaps, we may safely conclude that physics, astronomy, medicine, and all other disciplines which involve the study of composite things are indeed doubtful, but that arithmetic, geometry, and other disciplines of the same kind, which deal only with the very simplest and most general things, and care little about whether they exist in nature or not, contain something certain and indubitable. For whether I am waking or sleeping, 2 plus 3 equals 5, and a square has no more sides than 4. Nor does it seem possible that such obvious truths could be affected by any suspicion that they are false. I don't know how much I personally would agree with those things. I'm not sure. Don't know. I think they can be doubted, right? Maybe this is a difference in how we think about mathematics now or philosophy and stuff. I think you could sort of see these being the sort of more complex operations that arise out of some more fundamental sort of axioms. But at some level, the way in which we've accepted that kind of system for describing things is kind of arbitrary. Maybe less so with the geometry. I don't know. It requires more thought to put that. However, there is a certain opinion long fixed in my mind that there is a God who is all-powerful and by whom I was created as I am now. Now, how do I know that he has not brought it about, that there is no earth at all, no heavens, no extended things, no shape, no magnitude, no place, and yet that all these things appear to me to exist just as they do now? Or even, just as I judge now and again, that other people are mistaken about things they believe they know, with the greatest certitude that I too should be similarly deceived whenever I add 2 and 3, or count the sides of a square, or make a judgment about something even simpler, if anything simpler can be imagined. But perhaps God has not willed that I should be so cheated, for he is said to be supremely good. But if it were incompatible with his goodness to have created me such that I am perceptually deceived, it would seem equally inconsistent with that quality to permit me to be sometimes deceived. Nonetheless, I cannot doubt that he does permit it. Perhaps, indeed, there might be some people who would prefer to deny the existence of any God so powerful, rather than believing that all other things are uncertain. But let us not quarrel with them. I think the next bit is maybe a bit boring for a while, so I might skip to... Hence it seems to me, I shall not be acting unwisely, if willing myself to believe the contrary, I deceive myself and make believe for some considerable... wrong bit to skip to. I will therefore suppose that not God, who is perfectly good and the source of truth, but some evil spirit, supremely powerful and cunning, has devoted all his efforts to deceiving me. So basically Descartes just saying that even though it could be God who's deceiving him, it can't be God because, God's the summum bonum, the name for the bakery that V wanted to create. I know it's bonum, but V wanted bonum. And... is God a man that who should tell a lie in Deuteronomy and so forth? So, Descartes doesn't directly quote the scriptures, but he uses philosophia. I will think that the sky, the air, the earth, colors, shapes, sounds, and all external things are no different from the illusions of our dreams, and that they are traps he has laid for my credulity. I will consider myself as having no hands, no eyes, no flesh, no blood, and no senses, but yet, as falsely believing that I have all these, I will obstinately cling to these thoughts, and in this way, if indeed it is not in my power to discover any truth, yet certainly to the best of my ability and determination, I will take care not to give my assent to anything false or to allow this deceiver, however powerful and cunning he may be, to impose on me in any way. But to carry out this plan requires great effort, and there is a kind of indolence, a new word for me as well, that drags me back to my customary way of life, just as a prisoner who was perhaps enjoying an imaginary freedom in his dreams, when he then begins to suspect that he is asleep, is afraid of being woken up, and lets himself sink back into his soothing illusions. So I, of my own accord, slip back into my former opinions, and am scared to awake, for fear that tranquil sleep will give way to laborious hours of waking, which from now on I shall have to spend not in any kind of light, but in the unrelenting darkness of the difficulties just stirred up. So, thus concludes the first meditation. Descartes has actually written the meditations to sort of poetically reflect the days of creation of God, and they're meant to be read over a series of days by the reader and reflected upon in that sense. Just a little side bit for you to know. Okay, so reflecting on what we've seen there, what we've just heard, and do let me know if there's any questions or thoughts in the chat as we go along. I'm just going to say some things that Simon Blackburn has in his commentary on it. So, yeah, when we're talking about knowledge, and obviously there's a difficulty in how exactly precisely we define knowledge, but as an introduction to that problem, it will do to say that a knowledge is a kind of belief that we have that's on a more solid foundation. It seems that it has to be true in some way, and it seems that it has to be justified in some way. We maybe in a way that's creditable to us for forming that belief. It can't just be that we believe it and it's true by luck. We have to have come to that by some method of justification or something like that. Now, there are problems with getting an exact definition, but that's if you've not thought about this before, you're probably aware of it at some kind of tacit level, right? That there are things we believe about the world, but they're kind of shaky, or to use Descartes' word, or they're not kind of justified in some way. So yeah, he basically goes through these three waves: the senses, that he might be dreaming, that an evil demon might be deceiving him, and where's my highlighter when I need it? So yeah, here's what Peter Markey has to say in I know, edited by John Cottingham, a series of essays. So this essay being by Peter Markey. So the central problem, Descartes goes on to define the central problem of epistemology for the next 300 years. How can we move from our certain knowledge of the content of our experience to a knowledge of its cause? How can we know whether our experience is caused by an external world that is basically the way the content of our experience represents it as being, or by an external world that is radically different? So, I have this experience of the world. I have certain perceptions of it, but in what way can I tell that? Let's say here's a visual representation. So there's some kind of what would I call it? Cuboid shape with an image on it of light and so forth before my eyes, and I've got a sense of feeling through my hand and arm and everything like that. But how can I be sure that there's actually an object in my experience that is as I perceive it, that is generating that? In modern terms, we might think in a brain in a vat, for example. If you were to stimulate the right neurons, you could create all the exact same sense perceptions. Hypothetically, this is philosophy, not science, so you scientists stay out of the chat. And if we could do that, in what way could we say when something is actually created by the term veridical, by the actual object in itself, or not? And this is what Descartes is doing with these waves of skeptical doubt. Yeah, the camera's focus is automatic, unfortunately, so it goes in and out. So that's the question, if you've kind of got that point. So yeah, and then another note is just that what Descartes' kind of thinks he has to do in terms of epistemology here is what's kind of known as classical foundationalism now, which is the view that all our knowledge begins with some self-evident beliefs which are not evidenced by any others, but yet provide our justification for all the rest that we know. So, for example, there's something called Agrippa's trilemma, and I'm going to forget it as I try and recall it now. And it's basically something like, like any justification for account of knowledge is either unjustified, right? In which case it's difficult to say how it's knowledge as distinguished from a lucky true belief, or there's an infinite regress of justification, which seems kind of absurd in some sense, or there's like a circular justification for it. What the way that people deal with this in various ways, but the way that kind of Descartes is approaching this problem for knowledge is he's saying there is this bedrock that he reaches, this bedrock of certainty. I think he refers to it as like an Archimedean point from which he can lift all things. So that is what Descartes is going for. Now, some more books. Boom. This book, The Unity of Philosophical Experience by Etienne Gilson, who is, was, I think he's dead, a Catholic philosopher, but a very good philosopher. And this book has some interesting observations across time about basically from medieval up to modern times, where he sees philosophies or philosophers as having gone wrong, like the commonly recurring mistakes. And Gilson's also a great historian, so he provides some insight into Descartes and why he might be kind of going down this particular route. So let me just find my highlights. So yeah, the whole philosophy of Descartes was virtually contained in that initial decision, and we've not really got to this point yet. For the I think, hence I am, is the first principle of Descartes' philosophy, but it is his pledge to mathematical evidence that led Descartes to the I think. This, I'm afraid, was one of those initial decisions which beget systems of philosophy where everything is conclusively justified except their very principle. So this is kind of like, when someone like T-Jump, who leans towards like verificationism, is debating someone to make it relatable to all the cool kids who watch my channel. You want cool kids watching T-Jump, cool kids watching me. Often theists will say something like, well, can the verification principle verify itself, or something like that? It's saying this kind of objection applies against what Descartes is doing. If we need a philosophy whose certitude is equal to that of mathematics, our first principle will have to be that I think. But do we need such a philosophy? And supposing we do, can we have it? In other words, are we sure that everything that is susceptible of a mathematically evident interpretation? Are we sure that everything that is susceptible of a mathematically evident interpretation? The answer, of course, is arbitrary. You have a full right to bet on the affirmative, but it is gambling. And if by any chance you happen to be wrong, you will be playing a losing game from the beginning to end. Everything will be mathematically proved in your philosophy, save only this, that everything can and must be mathematically proved. There's another quote I would like to get to, but let me just check that I'm in the right place. Yes. So it talks a little bit about the kind of origins of because no other philosophies exist in the world. Being silly. I mean, I get what you're saying, but just hold out, because other people believe other things and they manage to do okay. Well, for example, I mean, we'll get onto things, but one of John Locke's objections, for example, is that, people sleep, right? So Descartes' argument only works while you're thinking, I am thinking. And I know, but, people go to sleep. Do people cease to exist when they sleep? It's not, there's a lot of problems. Anyway. Descartes inherited from Clavius something much more valuable. So Clavius is a mathematical tutor of Descartes at some point in his history. The spirit of mathematical learning. Let us only read the introductions of Clavius to the 1611 edition of his complete mathematical works. So this is Clavius writing, not Descartes here. The mathematical disciplines demonstrate and justify by the most solid reasons everything they may call for discussion, so that they truly beget science in and completely drive out all doubts from the mind of the student. This can hardly be said of other sciences, where most of the time the intellect remains hesitating and dubious about any truth value of the conclusions. So manifold are the opinions and so conflicting the judgments, leaving aside other philosophers, that many sects of the Peripatetics are enough to prove it. All born of Aristotle as the various branches of a common trunk, they disagree so completely with each other, and sometimes with Aristotle himself, who is their source, that it's quite impossible to know what Aristotle was really after, or whether his philosophy was primarily concerned with words or with things. Such is the reason why, among his interpreters, some will follow the Greeks, some others will follow the Latins or the Arabs or the nominalists or the so-called realists, and yet all boast that they are peripatetics. So I suppose that everyone sees how far all that is from mathematical demonstrations. The theorems of Euclid, as well as those of the other mathematicians, are just as purely true today, as safe in their hands, as firm and solid in their demonstrations, as they already were in schools many centuries ago. Since, therefore, mathematical disciplines are so exclusively dedicated to the love and cultivation of truth that nothing is received there of what is false, nor even of that which is merely probable, there is no doubt that the first place among the sciences should be conceded to mathematics. So that's what Clavius and has to say, and Descartes, kind of under this guy's tuition, Gilson's sort of hypothesizing that this general attitude of mathematics is having this chief form of certain knowledge as compared to everything else is something that Descartes picks up. It's interesting to note as well when Clavius talks about the certainty, for example, of the proofs of Euclid, that a couple of hundred years later, when was Euler around? Was it like 1600, 1700, something like that? And then Riemann and others sort of, disproving Euclidean geometry, and sorry. So disproving Euclidean geometry, and many of the proofs of Euclidean geometry don't work anymore, or don't work. And there's a new system called hyperbolic geometry, which sort of raises more questions about what's really going on with mathematics. Do we have certain knowledge there, or are we skeptical of it? Was there something else I was thinking of? I can't remember. Just want to say thank you, John Buck, for your super chat. Hope that work is goes by fast, that it's meaningful, and that isn't too bad. Anyway, so something else then. There was something else I wanted to mention, which is also the Kagito argument that Descartes uses was mentioned by Augustine much, Augustine, who lived something like 1,000 years before Descartes plus. And yeah, here's what Augustine had to say about roundabout. And if you know the numbers, call me out on it, so people can learn, myself included. Found in Soliloquies, Book 2, Chapter 1. And this character Reason is leading the discussion. You who wish to know yourself, do you know at least that you are? I know it. How do you know it? I don't know. Are you a thing that is simple or that is composed? I don't know. Do you know whether you are moving or not? I don't know. But do you know that you think? Yes, I know that. Consequently, that you think at least is true. It is true. You know, therefore, that you are, that you live, and that you think. Such also was the first evidence with Descartes, laid down as the unshakable cornerstone of his philosophy. I think, hence I am. So that's interesting. historical note, to sort of say the least. I'm just thinking, there were some other interesting points that John Locke raises, and also Hume. Both Locke and Hume destroyed Descartes, in my view, but we'll be possibly kind of coming onto that. Locke in an essay concerning human understanding, and it is book 1, chapter something. Chapter 10, I think. Let me see. Book 2, chapter 1, actually. See, I got that completely wrong. And I also didn't read the page. 95-ish? Here we are. I mean, it's almost too long to read in whole on here, and then we'd be doing this whole other analysis. But there's some really devastating critiques, especially for the type of Cartesian dualism that Cartesians, and you'll see a lot of Christian apologists sort of parroting some of the arguments that Descartes gives as well for why the mental must be a different metaphysical substance. You know, we're talking of substances here to the physical world. What Descartes calls like res extensa and res cogitans, extended matter and cognitive matter. Maybe that second one's a bad translation. I don't know, because I only speak bad German and a bit of Greek and English. So we will talk about some of the stuff that Locke's got to say momentarily when we come on to this idea of mind as like this separate metaphysical substance or whatever. But for now, I think what we shall do, let me just check. I do have some notes, actually. Let me just check if there's anything else in my notes that we should be looking at, perhaps. So we've covered the 3 waves of doubt, right? We've covered Descartes defines the central problems of epistemology. Yeah. So yeah. Then what we're going to come on to now is what's famously known as the Cogito argument, cogito ergo sum, in Latin. I can't remember if he wrote the book in French or Latin first. I know it's printed in both editions around the time, and it's worth remembering as we kind of read this as well, not to think about this argument, I am thinking, therefore I am, as like a propositional sentence in a natural language, but more to do with like the phenomenal experience of thinking and directly perceiving that one is thinking. And for Descartes, all clear and distinct perceptions are certain. So if you directly, non-inferentially, clearly and distinctly perceive a proposition about your thought, then it exists, is what Descartes thinks. Don't make me defend that claim. This is the foundation that Descartes uses to build up back the world of certain knowledge. And Simon Blackburn comments on this. I look at it from the demon's point of view. His project was to deceive me about everything, but it is logically impossible for him to deceive me into thinking that I exist when I do not. And I accidentally said it is not, which is silly of me. So yeah, let's plow on into the second meditation. My neck feels very weird. So, second meditation, and I'm not going to be silly. So, of the nature of the human mind, that it is more easily known than the body. Yesterday's meditation has plunged me into so many doubts that I still cannot put them out of my mind, nor, on the other hand, I can put my thingy straight now. Fee's gone as well. Isn't that absolutely brilliant? I wish refocus. I need some yoga. Oh, I see. Yes, I will do yoga this weekend. Yesterday's meditation has plunged me into so many doubts. I think it might be the light, maybe. Maybe the camera's confused by the light. I'm gonna... I don't know that that'll help. But thence we goeth. Be ready for much more of that language. It focused... Okay. Yesterday's meditation has plunged me into so many doubts that I still cannot put them out of my mind, nor, on the other hand, can I see any way to resolve them. But, as if I had suddenly slipped into a deep whirlpool, I am in such difficulties that I can neither touch the bottom with my foot nor swim back to the surface. Yet I will struggle on, and I will try the same path again as the one I set out on yesterday, that is to say, eliminating everything in which there is the smallest element of doubt, exactly as if I had found it to be false, through and through. And I shall pursue my way until I discover something certain, or failing that, discover that it is certain only that nothing is certain. Archimedes claimed that if only he had a point that was firm and immovable, he would move the whole earth. And great things are likewise to be hoped, if I can find just one little thing that is certain and unshakable. I therefore suppose that all I see is false. I believe that none of those things represented by my deceitful memory has ever existed. In fact, I have no senses at all. Body, shape, extension, in space, motion, and place itself are all illusions. What truth then is left? Perhaps this alone, that nothing is certain. But how do I know that there is not something different from all these things I have just listed, about which there is not the slightest room for doubt? Is there not, after all, some God, or whatever he should be called, that puts these thoughts into my mind? But why should I think that, when perhaps I myself could be the source of these thoughts? But am I at least not something after all? But I have already denied that I have any senses or any body. Now I am at a loss, because what follows from this? Am I so bound up with my body and senses that I cannot exist without them? But I convinced myself that there was nothing at all in the world, no sky, no earth, no minds, no bodies. Did I therefore not also convince myself that I did not exist either? No, certainly I did exist. If I convinced myself of something, but there is some deceiver or other, supremely powerful and cunning, who is deliberately deceiving me all the time. Beyond doubt, then, I also exist if he is deceiving me, and he can deceive me all he likes, but he will never bring it about that I should be nothing as long as I think I am something. So that, having weighted all these considerations sufficiently, and more than sufficiently, I can finally decide that the proposition, I am, I exist, whenever it is uttered by me, or conceived in the mind, is necessarily true. But indeed, I do not yet sufficiently understand what in fact this I is that now necessarily exists, so that from now on, yeah, we'll pause there for a moment. I guess we sort of already alluded at this argument. We kind of described it, that what Descartes' thinking is that even if he's being deceived about all these things, it would be impossible for him to be deceived that he is thinking when he thinks that he's thinking. You know, when he's immediately aware of the fact that he's having some phenomenal experience, that he's the camera's doing all sorts of weird things. That he's experiencing something. Yeah, this is the Kagito ergo sum, and so let's think about that. I mean, should Descartes be skeptical of this point even? I mean, some people there's a lot of things people say about this, right? So some people might be like, well, he's arguing in a circle, the Cartesian circle. Maybe we'll come to talk about that at some point. Some people will say Descartes kind of commits the masked man fallacy, which, let me see if there's a simple way of describing it. Let me share my screen. So just on Oxford reference here, fallacy allegedly committed by Descartes when he supposes that since he can know things about his mind while not knowing them about his body, his mind cannot be identical with the body. This, according to the charge, is like arguing that since I can know who my father is without knowing who the masked man is, the masked man cannot be my father. So yeah, suppose we're in a room and there's a masked man that comes in and we say, well, I know who my father is, but I don't know who the masked man is. So they've got all different properties. We'll come at maybe this applies perhaps more to these sort of arguments that are going to say that this cognition stuff is must be different from a different substance from the physical stuff. I should have stopped. So I just created an infinite regress for you guys down to one pixel. So, but now, yeah, Descartes like so there's a thinking thing, right? And there's this problem of hermeneutics. It's the same problems that Christians will face when they come to say, well, what's God really saying in the Bible? What does this mean? What does that mean? Where it's like, well, what does Descartes actually mean by this? Is he saying something exists? Is he saying propositionally, this or that? The way I tend to interpret it, and this might just be because it's the way the argument makes the most sense to me, is not as the propositional content in a language, but just the awareness that you're having an experience, which doesn't have to be represented by any particular symbol or language or, like a vocal utterance or whatever, just the mental, goings on. That while you're thinking that, it couldn't be brought about that, it couldn't be brought about that you had the impression of that without that being the case. That's something that is veridically produced. That's something we're aware of, that we perceive. That I think that kind of makes sense. But what is this I then that Descartes is questioning about? But indeed, I do not sufficiently understand what in fact this I is that now necessarily exists, so that from now on I must take care, in case I should happen imprudently to take something else to be me that is not me, and thus go astray in the very knowledge, cognition, that I claim to be the most certain and evident of all. Hence I shall now meditate afresh on what I once believed myself to be, before I fell into this train of thought. From this, I shall then subtract whatever it has been possible to cast doubt on, even in the slightest degree, by the reasons put forward above, so that in the end there shall remain exactly only that which is certain and unshakable. So what in fact did I think I was before all this? A human being, of course. But what's a human being? Shall I say a rational animal? No. For then I should have to examine what exactly an animal is, and what rational is, and hence, starting with one question, I should stumble into more difficult ones. Nor do I now have so much leisure that I can afford to fritter it away on subtleties of this kind, but here I shall rather direct my attention to thoughts that spontaneously, and by nature's prompting, came to my mind beforehand. Whenever I considered that I was, whenever I considered what I was, the first was that I have a face, hands, arms, and this whole mechanism of limbs, such as we see even in corpses. Sorry, I had a tab there. This I referred to as the body. Next, that I took nourishment, moved, perceived with my senses, and thought these actions indeed, and thought. I've forgotten how to read, guys. I'm very sorry. Next, that I took nourishment, moved, perceived with my senses, and thought. These actions indeed I attributed to the soul. What this soul was, however, either I never considered, or I imagined it was something very rarefied or subtle, like a wind or fire or thin air, infused into my coarser parts. But about the body itself, on the other hand, I had no doubts, but I thought I distinctly knew its nature, which, if I had attempted to describe how I conceived it in my mind, I would have explained as follows. By body, I mean everything that is capable of being bounded by some shape, of existing in a definite place, of filling a space in such a way as to exclude the presence of any other body within it, of being perceived by touch, sight, hearing, taste, or smell, and also of being moved in various ways, not indeed by itself, but by some other thing by which it is touched. For to have the power of moving itself, and also of perceiving by the senses or thinking, I judged could in no way belong to the nature of the body. Rather, I was puzzled by the fact that such capacities were found in certain bodies. But what about now, when I am supposing that some deceiver who is supremely powerful and, if I may venture to say so, evil, has been exerting all his efforts to delude me in every way? Can I affirm that I possess the slightest thing of all those that I have just said belong to the nature of the body? I consider, I think, I go over it all in my mind. Nothing comes up. It would be a waste of effort to go through the list again. But what about the attributes I used to ascribe to the soul? What about taking nourishment or moving? But since I now have no body, these are also nothing but illusions. What about sense perception? But certainly this does not take place without a body, and I have seemed to perceive very many things when asleep that I have later realized I had not perceived. What about thinking? Here I do find something, it is thought. This alone cannot be stripped from me. I am, I exist, this is certain, but for how long? Certainly only for as long as I am thinking. For perhaps, if I were to cease from all thinking, it might also come to pass that I might immediately cease altogether to exist. I am now admitting nothing except what is necessarily true. I am therefore speaking precisely only a thinking thing, that is, a mind or a soul or an intellect or a reason, words the meaning of which was previously unknown to me. I am therefore a true thing, and one that truly exists. But what kind of thing? I have said it already, one that thinks. So something here that may have been missed is the argument that Descartes kind of making seems to say, well, of the body, right, there's all these various properties that extended bodies possess. And all of the body properties are capable of being doubted, whereas the mental properties or the soul, and I am rather tempted to talk about the way that soul is used here as begging the question by inventing a name, but the way it's talked about is it doesn't have this property of being able to be doubted, and therefore Leibniz's law, the indiscernible of identicals, all things, if things are identical, they possess all the same properties. However, this res cogitans doesn't have the property of being able to be doubted, whereas res extensa, the body, does have the property of being able to be doubted. Therefore, there must be different substances that come apart. Now, I think the problem with this is that being doubted isn't being able to be doubted by René Descartes isn't a property of an object. It's a statement of epistemology about Descartes' access to the world, that he can doubt something or can't doubt something. So I think that that's sort of a faulty way of going about business, as it were. He goes on. What therefore am I? A thinking thing. What is that? I mean, a thing that doubts, that understands, that affirms, that denies, that wishes to do this and does not wish to do that, and also that imagines and perceives by the senses. And again, I'd say these are all things we'd agree to, but there's no reason to then, like to say it's a soul, you might as well say it's any word. You might as well say it's a lub glub or something, and just invent any word. There's no reason for it to be soul per se. At that moment in time. Just thinking, is there anything else pertinent to this for me to mention now? I don't think there is for right now, but basically Descartes goes on then to build up the rest of the world. He goes on to claim that he can prove that God exists, for example, and then he builds the external world, etc. From there, he offers 3 arguments for God as well. Maybe we can come onto those in another episode, but possibly now it might be a time to talk about what some of the people have to say about what Descartes had to say. So there's a more modern paper by it's still 100 years or so ago, by Gilbert Ryle, who is the guy who came up with the term ghost in the machine. So one thing that Ryle notes is that these kind of like the workings of minds had to be described by the mere negatives of the specific descriptions given to bodies. So there's no real description of minds that's given. It's just like the negation of it's just a negation of things that we can say do exist. Oh, it's not this, it's not this. But Ryle raises another thing. He calls what Descartes does a category mistake, which is to represent the facts of mental life as if they belong to one logical type or category when they actually belong to another. So one example of this might be, we imagine a university student, a student who's thinking of going to university. So they're going around universities and visiting them. And let's say they go to Oxford and they visit the various colleges that are in and around Oxford, and they say, well, this is all very, very well and good. This is all very nice, but where's the university? I want to see the university. All I've seen is, I've seen a building, I've seen another building, I walked down a few roads, a few kind of grassy areas, but where's the university? And it's that same category error where the university just is that thing that is the composition of all of those parts. What else? Descartes maintains that it is necessary for the soul always to think. If it is necessary, it ought to be so. Unfortunately, it's a fact that the soul is no more always thinking, the body is always moving. And then John Locke says, I confess myself to have one of those dull souls that doth not perceive itself always to contemplate ideas, nor can it conceive it any more necessary for the soul to think. We know certainly by experience that we sometimes think, and thence draw this infallible consequence that there is something in us that has a power to think. But whether that substance perceptually thinks or not, we can be no further assured than experience informs us. For to say that actual thinking is essential to the soul and inseparable from it is to beg what is in question and not to prove it by reason. It is begging it to bring us proof for it, an hypothesis, which is the very thing in dispute. And then I thought it was kind of humorous. Locke says, methinks every drowsy nod shakes their doctrine who teach that the soul is always thinking. I see no reason, therefore, to believe that the soul thinks before the senses have furnished it with ideas to think on. Another problem for this idea that the soul is like a distinct metaphysical substance is that of why it is that the soul only animates my body, for example, but it can't animate this book distinctly from me somewhere else in space. And Locke kind of raises this as an objection where he talks about, that if you imagine the coach carrying you from Oxford to London carries at the same time your soul with you, it's said that the soul stays in with the body that it's moving. It doesn't go somewhere else or start animating the wheels of the coach or something like that. So the soul constantly changes place during the whole journey between these points. What indeed does Descartes mean when he says that the mind has nothing to do with the body? Since mobility belongs to souls, why should not thought belong to bodies? If we're entitled to think one, why not the other? And then, not sure if this is on a related note, if sensations belong to the mind itself, nothing but the mind should be needed to account for their... Oh, yeah. So this is another point where... So Descartes goes on to sort of build up the external world. But a lot of philosophers following in the footsteps of what Descartes has to say reason something like the following: if sensations belong to the mind itself, nothing but the mind should be needed to account for their existence. But then there would be no reason to suppose that there is a material world, and actually doing so makes our sort of metaphysics more complicated than it needs to be. So there are various arguments given by people like Berkeley, that there's nothing like an idea but an idea. So I only know more ideas of what I kind of think is going on out there. Another person who's important is a theological objection. So there was an objection to Cartesian dualism raised by Princess Elizabeth, who's asking Descartes, well, how is it that this metaphysical substance actually interacts with the physical substance? Because if I'm moving my hands and that's by the will of the soul or something like that, how does that kind of causal chain actually manifest in the real world in some sense? And one way of dealing with this is something called occasionalism, which is that when there's a particular essentially, and I think there's still problems for this, but essentially when there's a particular movement in the soul, that God just so lines it up with the physical world to cause the efficient causes in the physical world somehow. I think maybe much like the Euthyphro dilemma, there's still questions about, well, how does that work? But either way, if this is true, Malebranche who once called Spinoza Le Miserable Spinoza, raises an important theological objection to this. If the mind and the body are separate metaphysical substances, then in order to correlate, occasionalism must be true, which we just described. But if it's not corporeal bodies, but God which produces in us sensations when we experience them, then this makes God a deceiver, because we don't always experience, we experience hallucinations and so forth, like Descartes just mentioned earlier. So God would be a deceiver, and so if we're theologically motivated, we must allow that corporeal things exist, and we must allow that it's not God that's deceiving us in this way. So there's one more thought to consider. The next and final thinker that we're going to consider on this topic will be David Hume. And I think what we're going to be Hume's Abstract of a Treatise of Human Nature is what this part is on in. And we're going to talk. Descartes, asserts that the soul, as far as we conceive it, is nothing but a system or train of different perceptions, those of heat and cold, love and anger, thoughts and sensations all united together, but without any perfect simplicity or identity. Descartes, I have no idea why he wrote it like that there, maintained that thought was the essence of the mind. Not this thought or that thought, but thought in general. This seems to be absolutely unintelligible, since everything that exists is particular, and therefore it must be our several particular perceptions that compose the mind. I say compose the mind, not belong to it. The mind is not a substance in which the perceptions inhere. That notion is as unintelligible as the Cartesian. That thought or perception in general is the essence of the mind. We have no idea or substance of any kind. Since we have no idea, but what is derived from some impression, and we have no impression of any substance, either material or spiritual, we know nothing but particular qualities and perceptions. As our idea of any body, a peach, for instance, is only that of a particular taste, color, figure, size, consistence, and so on. So our idea of any mind is only that of particular perceptions, without the notion of anything we call substance, either simple or compound. So what Hume is talking about here is basically this idea that it's very similar to Ryle's kind of objection of the kind of category mistake, where we visited all the colleges and we've said, where's the university in and of itself? Well, we have all these particular perceptions, but we don't have like a mind that we're sort of confusing the similarity of all of these things for identity and calling it a self in that sort of way. And this is actually an idea that is in Buddhism quite a lot, that's sort of the root of all suffering. So what I'm actually going to do is maybe we will play a little something. Let me see if we can. I need to share this. Hopefully it works okay. And
on the Philosopher's Zone, another summer highlight. And today, the problem with being you.
The whole point of this picture is, what's the root cause of suffering? The root cause of suffering is desire. Who's the being that is desiring? It's the self or the person. Get rid of the self or the person from the picture, and you cut out the root cause of desire.
Don't try it at home alone. You probably know of the Buddhist idea of no self. Sure takes care of the personal identity problem, but it does strike the Western ear as counterintuitive. Surely there's someone there, observing, feeling and acting. What are we missing in this puzzle? Today, two thinkers at the intersection of East and West. Alison Gopnik, child psychologist and philosopher, was famously rescued in midlife by David Hume. And this put her in touch with questions of self.
Well, like many people, when I was around 50, my life felt as if it was crumbling and falling apart. Nothing that was very dramatic, but in the sort of usual midlife. Children grow up, marriage ends. And a good kind of capsule way of describing it was that my sense of who I was felt much shakier than it had for the preceding 50 years. So a very clear personal identity felt as if it was sort of all over the map. And at the time, the way that I coped with that was mostly by reading. So I went to see my doctors at the time, and they prescribed Prozac and yoga and meditation, and I hated Prozac, and I was terrible at yoga. But meditation actually was sort of interesting, and like most academics, instead of sitting down and meditating, which is what I should have been doing, I started reading about meditation and reading about Buddhism. And as someone who'd been philosopher and a psychologist for my whole career, the first thing that struck me about this was how much many of the basic ideas in Buddhism sounded like David Hume. And that wasn't original to me. Lots of people have noticed that. So one of the very basic ideas in Buddhism is the idea that there actually isn't a God in the sense of a kind of all-knowing creature in charge of everything. The idea that there isn't any particular reason to believe in a real world that's a kind of foundation for our experience is an idea that's in Buddhism that's also in Hume. But more specifically, Buddhists very clearly deny what seems like a self-evident idea, which is that we have a self, that there's a single thing, which is me, which is going through the world and having experiences and being responsible for doing the things that I do. And to most people, it seems like that's the one thing that you couldn't contradict. That's what Descartes said, for example, when he said, cogito ergo sum. The one thing that I know for sure is that I exist. And Hume famously said he wasn't buying it. And he said, look, I look inside of my head and I see experiences and perceptions and knowledge and thoughts, but I don't see anything that looks like the self that's looking at all of those things. And that's almost exactly the same words that you see in a lot of the texts in Buddhism.
Is this Hume's bundle theory, the theory of we are bundles of things that come together?
Well, people tried to articulate it in various ways, both for Hume and for Buddhism. And there's various ways of interpreting it. But I think the way that both Hume and at least the great Buddhist philosophers who elaborated on this idea thought about it is, it's true that we think that we have a self. So he doesn't want to deny that we have this impression that we have a self, but there just isn't any basis for it. It doesn't do any work. There isn't any basis for it when we try to think about it more carefully. And that's something that a lot of modern psychology, including my own work, has concluded as well.
And as you say, it's a counterintuitive idea. One way around it, I suppose, is to split it into two. And it's interesting talking to you because you are both a philosopher and a psychologist. We can split it into an ontological concept and into a psychological ontological concept. Is that one way around this issue?
Well, it's interesting because, again, the great Buddhist Tibetan philosopher Tsongkhapa very explicitly said there's two ways of thinking about this. One is the way that's just part of our ordinary language, and that way is fine. And then there's this kind of ontological way. Is there really something that our ordinary language refers to? And he said that's where there really isn't anything there.
And yet it's such a struggle for the Western mind to get
Well, part
one's
of
head around
what's also very similar in kind of temperament and tone about Hume and the Buddhist tradition is that the kind of skeptical move, which has been part of philosophy from, as long as people have been doing philosophy, so asking what's real, is there really anything that is the basis for all of my experience? That's a very deep question. And for most people, that seemed like a very disturbing question. So if there isn't a God that underpins my life and there isn't a real world that underpins my experience, it feels like I've lost something. There's something really wrong about that. It's a tragedy. It's a defeat. It's a loss. And what both the Buddhist tradition and Hume say is, well, why do you think it's such a big deal, right? Is there anything about the way that you run your life that changes when there isn't a foundation? So you still have moral sentiments and feelings, which is something that both Hume and the Buddhist tradition talked about. You still have perceptions. The moon's just as bright. If you drop a cup, you catch it before it gets to the ground. None of that's different.
But why don't they just add up to become a self? I mean, your memories, your temperament, all those sorts of things you've just spoken about.
Well, I think that's sort of the idea. So the idea is they do. That's what we're talking about when we talk about a self. But I think the intuitive picture is that that's not enough. There ought to be something that's deeper and more profound and more real that underpins all of those experiences. And Hume's point and the Buddhist point is, suppose there isn't, it doesn't really make very much difference. It's not such a big deal. And actually, I think it's interesting. Both of them combine this denial of the self with a particular attitude towards ethics, which is quite different from the way that people have typically thought about ethics and morality.
Tell me about this, because one of the things I think there's a fear of is the snuffing out of ethics or a moral world.
Well, I think that's right. And what both Hume and the Buddhist tradition do is to ground our moral principles in our feelings of sympathy with other people. So essentially, the argument, and this is also an argument that the 20th century philosopher Derek Parfit made, is if you get rid of the sense that there has to be these very strong boundaries between myself and the world or between myself and other people, what effect that might have is to actually make you more open to other people, make you more empathic, make you more likely to rank other people's concerns and worries and welfare as important as your own. So I originally started thinking about this because I study children and relations between parents and children. And relations between parents and children are very interesting because, especially with young children, to some extent, in fact, I think it's true to say we shape their lives more than they shape their lives. So what happens to them depends, what happens to a 6-month-old really depends more on what her caregivers are doing than what she's doing. So in that case, it seems kind of straightforward to say, well, what's happening to that baby, the baby's actions, the baby's experiences are shaped as much by another person, if not more by another person than they are by themselves, by whatever's going on inside of them. And if you're thinking about mothers and babies, for example, or caregivers in general and babies, the line between what counts as being important for me and what counts as being important for you is much more porous. And I think that might be an interesting kind of model. It's a model that's there in some of the Asian traditions about the kind of foundational relations that underpin moral life. Very different from the picture, the sort of Hobbesian, typical Western picture that you've got a bunch of agents who have goals and desires and beliefs and are trying to coordinate their goals and desires and beliefs. And it's interesting that Hume very explicitly says that things like justice and government and economics and those kinds of moral questions are subsidiary. They're actually built on what he thinks is much more foundational, what he calls natural, which is this sentiment of sympathy that we have to the people that we're closest to.
So to this question of the theory of self, is it because one of the moves in Buddhist philosophy is to create it into a theory of mind, that in fact it isn't about all those things you're looking for to be a self, but it's in fact how the mind is constituted, and that's where you start to get to the emptiness, the nothingness, And I know that you've recently written about, for instance, animal minds, and how perhaps we have to start thinking a little bit more broadly about what theory of mind actually means in a Western context.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I worked on a long time ago, starting in the 80s, and was a big development in developmental psychology, was this idea that one of the things that we have to do as we get older is figure out how other people's minds work. And we talked about this being a theory of mind, or kind of like a scientist going out and making a theory. And at some points, people claimed that this was something that, say, differentiated us from non-human.
Anyway, I'm going to pause that there, and I'll put the link to that actually in the description for those who are interested. So you can go and watch that full thing if you're that way inclined. Either way, I hope you've sort of enjoyed this format, a little excursus into Descartes, some of his ideas around the self, around knowledge, and some kind of back and forth with how other people have interpreted that, some objections. Hope you've learned something, found it a fun way of learning, and then it's served its purpose if that's the case. Anyway, see ya.